field that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she builds planets on Earth, you guys.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Obscured Vision, a night of sonic storytelling. I'm James Wetzel. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the producer of adult programs at the Museum of Science Boston. I'm coming to you live from our Suit Cabot studio, and I am incredibly excited to kick off this show tonight and to be reunited virtually with our dear friends, producer and science reporter Ari Daniel and producer and sound designer Ian Coss. And we first collaborated with this duo on the original Obscured Vision, which we premiered to a sold-out audience here on site at the Museum of Science last fall. And we followed that up with a virtual encore of the original show this past spring. And all the while, Ari and Ian were hard at work on a new lineup of stories, which we are so pleased to be able to premiere for all of you tonight. Now, you're going to hear this a lot tonight, but we do ask you to dive into this experience with us as much as possible from the comfort of your own homes. So when you're listening to the stories, we encourage you to close your eyes, or better yet, if you have an eye mask handy, put on an eye mask, and if you can, to put on a pair of headphones to listen to the stories through. That's the optimal way to get the full experience. And this evening is a part of our current fall virtual season of adult programming. We have a fantastic lineup of free virtual events every week through the end of the year. Still some great stuff to come. So I encourage you to check that out by going to mos.org/adults. You can register for your spot in all of those events and sign up for our email list so that you can stay up to date on everything happening here at the Museum of Science, just like tonight, including our winter-spring season, which we will be announcing very, very, very soon. Now, I'll be back a little bit later on for a Q&A with Ari and Ian. So as questions come to mind tonight about the process, about the stories, you can feel free to submit them at any point by going to slido.com and using the code OBSCUREDVISION, all one word. Once again, that's Slido, SLIDO.com, with the code OBSCUREDVISION. I need to thank Barbara and Malcolm L. Sherman for their continued support of the adult programming here at the museum. Without them, we would not be here tonight. This event would not be happening, and it would not be free. So please join me in giving a huge round of applause, a virtual round of applause and thanks to Barbara and Malcolm L. Sherman. And finally, after the show tonight, I ask you to go to donate.mos.org/MOS at home and consider making a gift to allow us to keep bringing free virtual STEM experiences like tonight into all of your homes. Once again, that's donate.mos.org/MOS at home. But now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce to your stream your hosts for this evening, Ari Daniel and Ian Coss. Take it away, guys.
Thank you so much, James. So before we jump into the stories here in a minute, I do just want to reiterate what James was just saying. You know, for this show, the stories that Ari and I have created are stories for the ears. And so this isn't a night when you need to stare at your screen for the next hour. This is a night when maybe you can find a comfortable couch, lay down in bed, huddle under a table, stretch out on a carpet, find a comfortable place, put on a nice set of headphones, and just relax and ease into these stories. Ari, anything you want to add?
Yeah. First of all, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to James and the Museum of Science for having us. Ian and I have created kind of a travel theme for tonight. We're going to take you on 4 distinct journeys to 3 different continents. We figured that in this time when we're all kind of confined within our homes, our apartments, we would kind of use audio to spread our wings and take us to different places. And we know that people are joining us from lots of different places. This is the benefit of a virtual event. So we've got people listening from all over the world, and we're welcoming all of you. I will forewarn you that my kids may at some point come running in later on in the evening. And if that's the case, then they'll be part of the show as well. Ian, do you want to kick us off with the first story?
Sure. So go ahead and relax, close your eyes. If you have a blindfold or face mask or a simple cloth, go ahead and cover your eyes. And welcome to our first story. It's called On Pallet.
Hello, my name is Cayetana Vidal, and I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Por acá,
And right now I'm in Tomo Uno restaurant.
para tener la carta y una lista con platos extras.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias.
No, por favor.
For me, being in a kitchen is being with my dad. You know, every time I taste a wine, I kind of remember what he liked. Every time I have a wonderful meal, I just imagine, what he would have said and, being there, sitting with us. My first memory going out for dinner with my dad was going to a very fancy restaurant called Lola in the very fancy neighborhood of Recoleta in Buenos Aires. It was very elegant with white tablecloth, very shiny silverware, and all these waiters very well dressed. I was 10 years old and I was very excited to go to that place. We went there with my brother and sister, which we were all very excited. Everybody was, saying hello to my dad, and we felt like there was a very special treatment. I remember feeling very proud of my dad. He pushed us to try everything, right? He was like, okay, I'm gonna order, this endive with, Parmesan cheese, this liver pate. My brother and sister were more reluctant to try things, but I always liked to try everything. It seemed like an adventure. I remember that there was a dish in the list that was a milanesa, which is a very common dish here in Argentina. It's a cutlet. It's just breaded meat, fried. The presentation was amazing and everything. And so I cut this milanesa very slowly. And my dad was asking, how is it? What do you think? And I said, I think it's fried in olive oil instead of corn oil, which is what we normally use here. He called the chef and he asked, did you fry this in olive oil? And the guy was, yes, indeed it was. And so my dad was like, in awe. I couldn't believe that I figured that out. Normally 10 years old don't even know what olive oil really is, or that there are different kind of oils at all. I guess at that moment he decided that I would be his hair, that I would be the one doing the same thing he was doing, which is being a food critic. My father's name is Fernando Vidal Bussi.
Muy bien, Fernando, ¿cómo estás?
Vos sos una figura emblemática.
He's kind of a pioneer in Argentina.
¿Qué nos preparó esta vez, Fernando?
Vamos a probar un vino blanco que es...
He had a TV show at some point about wines, and then another one about restaurants.
¿Con un tenedor? No, yo lo veo.
Un cuadradito de pan.
So people would recognize him in the street, people asking for autographs, I don't know. And his critiques also were very respected by restaurants. They were all hoping to have my dad go eat to have their critiques in the magazine. So I guess he was kind of a celebrity in his field. During my childhood, I was always very close to my father. My mother was ill since I was little. She had depression, so she was going in and out psychiatric institutions. My dad, we were friends. We laughed about the same things. We were exactly the same person somehow, like we had the same personality and tastes. And he was my parent, basically, the parent I trusted. My mom, wasn't really there, and he always was there for me. He would take me to school, and we would go out for dinner. These outings with my dad were completely intoxicating. I really, it was like traveling, like going to another world. Growing up, being a teenager, I started having some more distance with my dad. He really wanted to push me onto writing about food. I just wanted to leave and start my own life. I wanted to go to film school, follow my passion. My dad was like, I don't think you're going to make a career on film. Until one day I said, I'm done with this. I applied to film school in New York. I got accepted. I'm leaving. He got so worried, I was making a mistake. But I moved to New York, went to NYU to do an MFA on film for 3 years. When I was leaving the US, I didn't talk to my dad too often. He would write me very long, melancholic emails.
Hijita del alma.
Like it was a monologue from him.
Tuve que imprimirla y leerla varias veces. Tu visión fue muy precisa.
We grew apart a lot. Also, it was interesting because living in New York, I started trying all these other types of food that I couldn't eat in Argentina that I didn't know about, like Asian food, Thai, Japanese. I remember telling him he didn't like that I knew more foods than he knew, like, hold on, I'm the authority here.
Pero esa es otra historia muy larga.
And then later on, when he was much older, when I came back from the United States, my dad had just divorced from his third marriage. He was 72 years old. He was living on his own, which he had never did. He was always married, always surrounded by people. So when I arrived, he was very depressed, and he didn't have any savings. So I started paying, a little bit of a close attention of what he was doing work-wise. That's when he actually sat with me again. He was like, you need to keep going with what I'm doing. He was very forward about it. And I really didn't feel at all like I wanted to do it. Suddenly, one day, this particular restaurant calls very angry because basically my dad had written about a restaurant that was completely different. He totally messed up, restaurants in his head. He would just write things that didn't make any sense at all. I can totally sense that something was wrong with him. He had a dementia that was advancing very quickly. I could tell that this was getting worse every day. We needed to take action on this. So at the beginning, I started going to these restaurants with him, and then I would take over and write the article, and he would sign it. So that's how I became my dad's ghostwriter. Before all, I had to protect being anonymous, right? Like I was trying to imitate what he was doing. So that felt like going back to school, right? Like I was back to, doing my homework to support the family. And that that wasn't nice. So I remember that it made me very, very nervous, like I was screwing up every article and did a lot of research. And I thank God there was internet at this time, right? Like already, so I could Google a lot of it. And, you know, that was a lot of pressure for me because I just felt like I needed to support this character, right? Like I needed to just hold everything about who he was for people to keep respecting him. But then, of course, this was a progression. My dad, he started almost not eating when he got dementia. He lost a lot of weight. He tasted wine and he would say, this is poison, which was a shocker because my dad loved wine. So I started going myself to the restaurants. Of course, the reservations were, you know, under his name, but I would show up and say, well, he couldn't make it. I'm his daughter. I'll be tasting the meal tonight. I went to Punta del Este, which is this, you know, beach place in Uruguay, to cover this restaurant. And I sit with the owner of the restaurant, and she tells me that she's a film producer, that she lives in Britain, and that she has done this film and this other film. And I was like, I'm a filmmaker. And I was working on this script, and I had brought it with me. And I gave it to her, and, you know, she read it, and she was like, oh, I think this is really interesting material. Let me see if there's something we can do, and we can figure it out, you know. You know, I didn't have my hopes too high, but it was a good opportunity. I wrote a great article about her restaurant. And then back in Buenos Aires, this lady was calling me to tell me that she wanted to take the project, that she wanted to make my film. And she was telling, okay, we'll have Vanessa Paradis be the star, you know, this French actress. And I was like, what's going on? And my dad was the moment of the day that he would go out for a walk. And I was on Skype with this woman, and my dad was like, I need to go, screaming with me. You know, my dad started hitting the door, making a lot of noise. And he was like, what are you doing with that computer? And this woman, you know, was trying to have a very serious conversation about how we were going to make my film. And I finally had to tell her, you know what, I'm having a situation with my dad right now. I really need to hang up, and I need to take care of this. And she wasn't happy at all. She wasn't nice about it. Finally hung up and left with my dad, and we went for his fucking walk. Then later on, he was in a hospital, and again, this woman calls me. So again, I have to hang up on this woman. She was like, well, you know what? You need to make a decision. Are you going to take care of your dad, or are you going to make your film? And again, for me, there was no doubt. I was just so, you know, positive that was my role at that moment, you know, to be there for him. I think my love for my dad was too big. I don't know. I had never any doubts that was what I had to do. He meant a lot, you know. He meant so much to me, that more than anything else that I could do. Well, the end, I did call the magazine and I said, okay, my dad is going to die soon. I've been doing his job. And that's when they said, we knew all along, and we want you to keep doing it with your own signature. So it was a relief, but also a decision. This is serious now. This is now me doing this. Do I want to do it? But then, you know, like 6 years had passed and since my dad died, and I'm still doing it. Squeezed tomato and poached quail egg. The way the tomato is prepared, like it's like con cassé. The shrimp chupe, which is a traditional Peruvian plate that my dad loved. Today, I ride my restaurant critique every week. Okay, so I'm putting some of that buttery sauce on the tentacles and just tasting it. I think I have my own voice, but I get very mixed up. And kind of like my dad's voice speaks the loudest to me. Sometimes I mistake that voice with my own because we were so similar and we have similar tastes and sense of humor and sensibilities, you know. But then sometimes it goes too far, you know, this voice speaks too loud. And I have to just sort of shut that voice down in my head. And I do have a voice of my own that has nothing to do with my dad's voice. And that's kind of the voice that sometimes I have trouble finding. Or hearing.
Welcome back. You can take off your blindfold and rejoin us here. You know, when Ian and I set out to work on this project, finding the stories is obviously absolutely essential. And the museum of Science kind of welcomed us to find stories of all sorts and kind of intentionally said, find stories that don't have anything to do with science. If they do, great, but that wasn't a requirement. And
in fact, it almost would have been easier if they'd given us that limitation. But
yeah,
without it, was sort of like the world of storytelling is open.
So Ian and I started kind of turning over rocks and digging around, looking for possibilities. And once we kind of knew we were working on this show, I spoke to a friend of mine who had spent some time living in Argentina. And I told her, I said, I don't know if you know of anybody in Argentina that might have an interesting story to tell. And she told me about Kai and said she might be willing to talk to me. And I said, well, I'd love to hear more about her story. She just gave me kind of a brief outline about it. And so earlier this year, back in the before times in January, I talked to her on the phone and she told me about her dad and about what you just heard. And it's a story that she's actually been interested in telling herself and has been and entrusted me and Ian with telling on her behalf, or at least this version of it. And so, you know, my role in this process was to kind of do the interview with Kai. I spoke to her for probably about an hour and a half, 2 hours. We did it remotely. We worked with somebody in Argentina who recorded her in person, and I also, you know, kind of helped that recordist gather the sound in the restaurants. And then I sat with that kind of hour and a half, 2 hours of audio and gradually whittled it down and created the rough structure of the story from beginning to end. And at that point, I handed it off to Ian, who took it from there.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Ari, I love that story so much, and it's one of those stories that you wouldn't necessarily, if you went looking for a story about food or about Argentina, you might not ever stumble on that story. But there's something really serendipitous about how that came to you and how you were able to sort of, to bring it to the show. So my role on the project for most of these stories is as a composer and sound designer. So what Ari sends to me is kind of a rough layout of just the interview audio. So just Kai's voice in this case. And then it's my job to kind of add in all those other sounds that you're hearing around it to kind of orchestrate it and bring it to life. This story posed a kind of interesting challenge because I guess there are really two main characters in it. It's really about Kai and her father. And of course, we had the whole story in Kai's voice, but we didn't have her father. And so part of our, challenge in bringing it to life was to kind of bring her father to life in the story itself. So we went about that a bunch of different ways. We were able to find some clips from his TV show online, which you heard in there. There were some of those letters that she describes exchanging with her father, which she was able to get a family friend to actually read those out loud and record them. So that's not his voice reading the letters, but those are his actual words. And then there was actually some ambient sound that Kai had recorded in their home, in that apartment in Buenos Aires with her father, that we're able to incorporate as well. But then even going beyond that to there's that moment where you hear the knocking on the door where he's outside. That's not the sound of him actually knocking, but it is another little way to kind of invoke his presence sonically, even in the absence of his voice in the story. So it's that I think that for this kind of story, there's a play between what's there and what's not there. And my job is sort of to invoke what's not there through the sound design.
And to make it sound seamless.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully in our process, there's a very clear divide between, Ari does this part and Ian does that part. But hopefully when you hear it, it doesn't come to you as, here's a story with a bunch of bells and whistles laid on top of it. Hopefully it just feels like a story. So.
And with that, I think we're going to turn you over to our second story. The title of it is On Pachyderms. Please put on your blindfolds and snug those earphones around your ears, and we'll see you back when it's over.
I happened to be near Amboseli, which is a world-famous national park. It's in Kenya, situated on the Tanzania border. So you have Kilimanjaro looming over Amboseli, quite hot, and it's dry and dusty. It has this red dust. So I was working actually in the swamp called Kimana Swamp, early in the morning, lovely and cool. I love working at that time of day. It's like a sort of ballet, really. The noises, the amphibians, the frogs and the toads, the birds, the insects, lions, and everything's making a noise at that time of day. I'd been working on rinderpest virus. Rinderpest was a great plague, actually, that came into Africa and killed huge numbers of animals. The whole ecosystem was impacted by this one virus. Measles is the close relative. In fact, it evolved from rinderpest when we domesticated cattle. So I worked, with a team of people who focused on the elimination of this virus through vaccination. We found a herd of buffalo, approached them slowly. I managed to get 3 darts in. And so we had 3 animals to work with, basically. I did the last animal on my own. Not something I would normally do. I'd like to have somebody with me, but it was lying down on its side. And so I was totally focused on getting the job done, taking out syringes and needles and vials to take blood. And it's just like something happened. It's not that things went quiet. They were quiet, but something changed, and I felt a presence. I definitely felt something behind me. I sort of didn't move. I've had enough experience with animals to know that don't ever do anything precipitous. They're incredibly sensitive to movement, to sound, and so on. So the best thing is to be still. So I did exactly that and just sort of quietly turned my head. And there was just this, massive animal behind me. It was an elephant, big female, with its aunts and young, some probably 4 or 5-year-olds, some calves. And so it was like a little family group that had walked up to see what I was doing. But they're incredibly quiet, elephant. They have big feet, and on this dusty soil, they don't make any noise. You do have an initial, obviously your heart rate goes up because you're the thing's right next to you. So you've just got to, hold on to yourself. and not to twitch and, scratch your nose and all that sort of stuff. But the matriarch, the big one, was really, really close, and she was sort of literally, beginning to sort of smell and looking, and the presence of them was just so big. But Amboseli is known for calm elephant, because there's not been aggressive behavior from humans there. There's been no hunting, no shooting, no threatening. The animals were not worried. They were just inquisitive. And the animals eventually moved off. Yeah, so my name is Richard Cock, and I'm a professor at the University of London at the Royal Veterinary College, and I'm a professor of wildlife health, actually, so it's an unusual position, not many of those around the world. On another occasion in Kenya, we had a call that came into our department for an injured elephant. And I had a colleague with me who was Richard Lloyd Morgan.
I'm an Anglican minister, an Episcopalian minister. But before I got ordained, I was an opera singer.
He was an opera singer, of all things.
I was coming out to visit my sister in Nairobi, and I've always been interested in conservation and in wildlife. And I have a camera, and if he wanted, I would be happy to come and take some photographs of his work. So he said, yes, come and stay.
In this case, one had to fly to the area. It was in the far north.
It was a small aeroplane, a little Cessna, that we flew up.
A place called Kerio Valley.
Parallel to the Rift Valley, sort of north of Nairobi.
Which had a bit of a reputation. The elephants were very aggressive. It was an unusual valley, one of these sort of high-sided sort of cliffs with a river running down it. And dry, really hot and dry.
As I remember it, there was a report that came in to Richard that there was an elephant which had been injured by a spear.
What some of these folk do when they want to kill an elephant is that they get a big log and they put a spear through the log and they hang this log in one of these big trees. They wait patiently and they drop it, hoping to pierce the spine. But of course, mostly it doesn't happen that way, and they end up with, the spear into the chest or into the abdomen. And that's what happened with this elephant. So this elephant would have been absolutely in great pain and, extremely angry.
So Richard decided he'd go and see if we could find this animal and, if possible, get the spear head out.
Normally, when we do elephant work on the ground, we would have an aircraft as a safety measure. But unfortunately, the aircraft couldn't stay. It had to leave me. So I then joined the rangers. We drove down a very rough track into the gorge. Richard came down, with us. But I was acutely aware that he was not, experienced in the bush.
I mean, I've always been interested in it, but I don't have the faintest qualifications.
We picked up tracks, and I remember at the time saying to them, I thought there were more than one elephant. There seemed to be too many footprints. And the guy said, no, it's just one elephant. And we carried on. And we came to a lovely old fig tree, and I thought, right, this is good, because the dung was looking a bit fresh. I said, we must be getting quite close. So I said to Richard, this is where you stay, and we will come back as soon as we've got the animal sorted.
So Richard had a dart gun loaded with a pretty powerful anesthetic. And Richard went off one way with the gun.
I saw an elephant, and I said, well, that must be it. So we started walking towards that animal. But in fact, there was another elephant, the one that was injured, actually. It knew we were there. We didn't know it was there. So we're now in quite thick bush, and you can't see that well, so it's not like it's open.
Suddenly, I heard a sort of trumpeting. You don't have to be, a wildlife expert to recognize an elephant when you hear it trumpeting. And I thought, oh, dear God, it's rather close. The lads vanished.
The rangers were caught totally unawares, so I don't blame them, and they ran. They ran as fast as they could.
And they just evaporated into the bush.
They went in one direction, and, to avoid falling over each other, I ran in another direction.
And I turned round and ran away from the sound. And don't tell me that it's pointless running away from an elephant, because I know.
And so I'm now running for my life. I mean, absolutely no question, with this extremely angry bull elephant with big tusks. And it was not really using the path, it was just crashing through the bush. So it just kept hitting trees and so on. And I was just keeping ahead of it.
And then I heard the trumpeting coming from the direction in which I was running. And I thought, well, that animal is moving very quickly.
And I was now really at the end of my resilience, and I sort of slid into this muddy stream and rolled onto my back, and this elephant came. And as he hit the edge of the stream, he slipped. So he came down the bank, sort of literally on his knees. You know, you can imagine this elephant sort of, you know, bucketing, you know, and his feet came forward, and then his head came down. Bang! One tusk came down on my left and the other on my right, you know, and penetrated the soil quite deeply.
And then, of course, it dawned on me that it wasn't one elephant, it was two. At which point this animal emerged out of the bush with its, you know, ears sideways and its trunk up and trumpeting.
I was expecting lights out. The animal's head was literally inches away from my head. You know, I was in total shock, staring at this elephant's eye, and you know it's looking at you, and it's, you know, it's absorbing, you know, it's absorbing you. I mean, you know, you are the focus. You are in its retina, just you. You know, and it's like time stopped.
And that's when I tripped and fell, and I went over on my ankle, and I didn't break, but it sprained.
And it's like a silence, but you know, it's a suspended silence, because you know it's not going to end there.
But if it was a question of limping around on a twisted ankle or getting squashed by an elephant, there's no choice.
You know, you could just sense that if he could just get closer to me, he would have crushed me. And that's what they do, elephant. They kneel on you or push their head. But, you know, so he just couldn't do it. So then eventually he got a bit of footing, and he pulled himself back out of this, you know, muddy stream. And I'm lying there looking up at him, waiting for him to kill me.
I thought I was quite likely to be killed. And it would have been my own fault for being in the wrong place at the wrong time with an angry elephant.
It was one of those moments. I could see him looking at me. And so I'm looking at it, looking at me. And it was like he was deciding, should I, shouldn't I?
And it must have been just a dummy charge, because it veered off.
And, you know, he began shaking his head and flapping his ears, and he just turned and he ran. And I'm left there lying in the stream. I hadn't breathed, I think, for a good minute, you know. I just sort of, you know, exhaled, inhaled, you know, just so thankful that I hadn't been killed. Two or 3 days later, we actually got a helicopter, and I darted the animal.
The wound was in its shoulder, and he stuck his hand in the shoulder, fished around for a spear point.
And we took the spear out. I was chuffed that we could do something for this animal, and I was very pleased that it could get up and recover from that, and hopefully, you know, that it lived a longer life, and, you know, that it decided that we weren't so bad after all. I don't know.
And we all lived to tell the tale.
As human beings, as you know, as we've evolved, you know, and we've sensed our own power, we've torn ourselves away from nature, and we've always behaved as if it's good to organize nature, to control it, to get rid of it, you know, when it is irritating or is a problem for you. All these things, in a way, are very counter to nature.
You're in these animals' environment, and you're the guest, if you see what I mean. I don't think we do have dominion over them. You are there on sufferance. It's not your property. It's not your right to be there.
I think working with wildlife, you sense that actually it's part of you. So you feel an intimacy with something other than a human being, and it's very, very special.
End of sermon.
Welcome back, everyone. Give you a second to rejoin us. So this story we just heard was just like the first story. It came to us as just voices, just these two Richards telling this tale. And we had to sort of bring it to life. But this story was kind of different in that it is an incredibly visual story. It's cinematic almost, in this whole chase sequence. And so it was a lot of fun to try and bring that alive just in sound. I don't know if, Ari, I'm sure you've heard this, but I feel like audio producers often like to say that sound is, in a way, the most visual medium. Because, by creating just the sound, and the listener gets the chance to kind of fill in that visual picture for themselves. And we can do that in a lot of ways. I think in this piece, part of what I enjoyed about it is that you have these two stories actually going on at once in parallel. Both Richards have their own encounter with an elephant, and they're both kind of running for their lives. If it were shown on a movie screen, you'd have to sort of cut between them, or maybe you'd have a split screen, or with the visual, you have to choose what you're looking at any one moment. But with sound, the two can kind of bleed into each other. So you're kind of in both at once, and you hear a elephant trumpeting from one side, and you hear brush breaking from another side, and you can kind of choose your own vantage point and choose your own image that you create. Maybe the elephant's right in front of you, maybe it's right behind you. But the sound, in a way, it doesn't dictate all that. It offers up all these options. Some of them are very concrete, like the sound of the trumpet. Some of it is more abstract, just like the drumming and music and droning sounds that accompany it. But we just offer all that up, and then the listener gets to fill in the rest.
And Ian, you thought about interleaving those two voices from the very beginning. I think when I first sent you the cut, I had them more like I had the first Richard speaking for longer periods and the second Richard, and you had the great idea of essentially like bringing them together like a zipper, like small phrases that really echoed one another and brought the two into a kind of harmony with each other as they were both kind of telling their shared story from different perspectives.
Yeah, no, I find that kind of parallel storytelling, just very exciting, especially with these two where they have these, they're experiencing the same thing, but from very different personal vantage points. One is coming from this place of kind of, sober authority, and one from kind of wide-eyed surprise. And so, I just found that perspective of going through it side by side with both of them.
One of the most cinematic
really
moments to me, Ian, that you created was when we transition out of that like intense scene where we're not sure what's going to happen, and you fade out that kind of almost like a horn sound and fade up the flowing of a stream. To me, that was like very cinematic, because it's like we realized like, oh, we're coming out of almost like a trance, and we're moving back into a place where now Richard is more aware of his surroundings than just the elephant staring down at him. That's one of my favorite moments in the whole piece.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think with any sound design, or really, I mean, I think it's kind of true of design in general, that often what, the elements you take away end up being just as impactful as the elements that you keep in. So, having that whole sequence where there is, all you're hearing is kind of, you're just sort of in their heads, and you're not hearing the elephants, and you're not hearing the ambience, you're not hearing the stream. Then when all those sounds kind of creep back in, that in itself is impactful. So, the next story actually is a nice kind of contrast with this one, both from an experiential standpoint, and also maybe from a process standpoint. It is, so in the story we just heard, every single sound you heard, other than their voices, was something that, I found or created and brought into the story. It was not recorded on site. It is not the actual sound of that story. The story we're about to hear is the opposite. Every single sound that's in this next story was recorded in the field, so to speak. So in fact, the whole piece is based on a trip that I took last year. And so I was able to record this with the storyteller herself. And then we basically crafted the narrative based on that sound that was gathered out in the world. So it's more of, I guess, a documentary approach than a cinematic approach, but hopefully immersive in a different kind of way.
Even the music,
or maybe a similar kind of way.
The music is all original to this story, right? This is you created none of the music for this.
Yes, for this one I did not create the music exactly. The third story is called On Pots and Pans. You can go ahead and put your blindfolds back on.
My name is Maklit Hadero, and I am an Ethio jazz singer-songwriter. I make the music of In Between. I left Ethiopia when I was a little bit under 2 years old. And we came to the United States as refugees, so we couldn't go back. There was that sense of exile. And I grew up with this sense of a lot had been left behind, or a lot remained unsaid. But the ways that we would live our Ethiopianness was this very household way. So it was about food and language and music. My parents had these old tapes from Ethiopia and they would play them, and it was Mahmoud Ahmed and Aster Aweka, Mary Armadei, and Asnek Achwarku, and warped, garbled tapes that were precious and that my parents loved. The Ethiopian music was like our breadcrumbs that we would follow to get back. I went to Ethiopia for the first time when I was 21, the first time as an adult when I was 21. And I realized it on that trip just how much my understanding of Ethiopia was shaped by my parents' stories and how much had changed since they left. And so the only way to really know it was to go and to go again and to go again and to go again to really be able to have a real relationship with the country. So I've been back to Ethiopia 8 times in the last 20 years, but the most recent time was just this past year. We land in the middle of the night and my bags are lost and I don't really care, And I walk outside and the air is cool. It has this flavor. The air has a flavor. And it's fires burning. It's the smell of incense and spice. And so I just kind of stop and I breathe in slowly and I let it take me away. I let it move me. And that's how the trip begins. Okay, Salam is coming. I forgot I have one more call to make. This trip, when I go to Ethiopia, it's about music. I'm bringing my band with me, which I've only done once before, almost 10 years before. And within that gap of 10 years, I became a star in Ethiopia. sort of funny to have those words come out of my mouth, I'm a star. But it's true. My music is on television multiple times a day, every single day.
Someone's recognizing me in the car. So.
When I walk down the street, people recognize me. They sing my songs to me. And of course, it just melts my soul and makes me feel so grateful and humbled.
So he's coming to the show on Friday.
So whenever you go to a place, right, whoever you are in the world, people want to visit the place that gives them the pulse. For me, Mercato is an incredibly important part of that. So that's why I have to go whenever I go to Ethiopia. Mercato is the largest open-air market in Africa. Just to give you a sense of the scale, Mercato covers many square miles and employs more than 10,000 people. So this is absolutely massive.
Very large. And so look, and donkey and chicken and sheep, and you can't find everything is inside. So
our guide through this Mercato experience is Malakubalai.
You're coming here, yeah?
A dancer, choreographer, and owner of one of the hippest little traditional music houses in Addis Ababa called Fendiga.
Look, I will go inside in the also.
For him, Mercato is one of the most special places in Ethiopia, and he brings us to these back alleys that are not paved.
I almost got hit by a donkey.
Into the kind of heart of Mercato that I hadn't even known in previous trips.
We're like dodging guys with like 20 oil drums on their heads, walking through these tiny, narrow streets, and everything is happening at once. People are making things, selling things. It's like life happening.
You'll go through one area that's all breads being made with inset, the false banana root. You'll see the women making the bread there.
Some spices to make chili or barbare, we call it. Come.
You'll go through areas where it's stall after stall after stall of incense sellers. And they're all in these little bags made of old newspaper folded up, and they're just beautiful.
This is like for horse material.
There are the kinds of leather work that it takes to adorn horses.
Saddles, reins.
These red tassels.
A lot of jewelry for the horses.
There are areas of Mercato where they make these large cooking pans. Mercato is a place of transformation. There's an ethos of recycling where you don't waste anything, and that with ingenuity and work, most things can be reused, they can be fixed, they can be mended.
Look here, and they bring it. Now recycling again from here.
So you see this in Mercato a lot, because the metal workers who make these cooking pans, they're typically using scrap metals.
That's why the town become clean, otherwise mountain of garbage. Yeah.
So on these rooftops, you'll see metal rods from construction. And so these piles are massive. They're massive. Everything's sorted, everything has order, it's all ready to be made into something else. The men who shape this metal bang on the metal to bend it to their will. And so there's a cacophony of sound, right? But it all has a certain kind of rhythm.
That's rock and roll. So wow.
It's almost like stepping into a collection of drummers.
Music is everywhere, in the work, in the water, in the forest, not only in the stage, so that's the thing.
And so they bang their drums. And they make these cooking pans and cooking pots, but they're also calling the people saying, oh, you're looking for a cooking pot? Here I am. Here's where you find it. Here's where you find it. So what does this all have to do with making music? Being in a place like Mercato, being in Ethiopia, being in Addis Ababa, it's like filling up your well so that when I go back into the studio, I have water to drink. I think of songwriting and composing as a mix of discipline and mystery. So the mystery is that, well, is best summed up by Leonard Cohen, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said something like, if I knew where the good songs came from, I'd go there more often. But you might not know exactly where they come from, but you can create the environment that makes you ready to receive the melodies, that makes you ready to receive the great lyrics that just appear when you happen to be washing the dishes. And so when I fill my well by going to places like Mercato, by going to places like Fendik, by spending time in Ethiopia, what I find is when I go back to the studio, I've got a place to start. And then the discipline part of it, that mix of discipline and mystery, the discipline part of it is that you go to the studio and you take those and you shape them and you work on them. You hammer them like the men hammer the cooking pots. Like if you think about a pentatonic scale, that's 5 notes, right? But the job of a composer is to take those 5 notes and make something new out of them again and again and again, to hammer them, to shape them, to refire them into something that can be used not just by the ears, but by the hips and also by the soul, to turn them into music that can lift people, that can move people, that can inspire people all over the world.
Welcome back. Oh, that story's like a little jewel. So, I wanted to talk just a little bit about, about what it's like to share these stories with you. And, Ian and I have been working on them now for months and crafting them and shifting things, a little bit over and a little bit back to get them just right. So that's, it's amazing now to have this chance to share them with all of you, but it's also just an incredible for both of us to as producers, as reporters, as storytellers, as journalists, to be kind of continuously gifted with these stories to work with in the first place. I kind of alluded to this earlier with Kai's story and the story of her dad, that this is a story that she's been thinking about telling and wanting to tell for a long time, and one that she's still hoping to tell, perhaps through making a film about it, or writing something about it. But here she was willing to kind of open up and tell me and Ian about it, and by extension, tell all of you about it. That never ceases to kind of touch me. Mm-hmm. And I had a chance to interview somebody for another story for a different project, named Shanna McDonald. She works for Parks Canada, and she was telling me about this agreement to create a protected area up in the Northwest Territories of Canada to protect just a vast swath of the boreal forest up there. It was a trilateral agreement between the Crown government and with the Lutselk'dene First Nation people. And I asked her about the day that the agreement was signed. This was an agreement that was years in the making. And she told me, quote, "There are pictures of me walking around with a signed agreement clutched to my chest like a little baby bird, and I was never going to let go of it." And to me, that's what, like, when Ian and I get a story like Kai's, like the Richards, like McLeet's, or about this last one that we're going to share with you, that's what it's like. It's like a little baby bird, you know, that we have, and that is so delicate and precious, and in some ways in all ways doesn't belong to us. You know, we're just kind of taking care of it for a moment before we kind of set it aloft.
Right. Yeah, and especially with, you know, with something like this where it's not simply, you know, recording the interview and publishing it. You know, it's really recording it and editing it and refining it and sort of dramatizing it in a sense. There is, a lot of care in that, because these are people's real stories and real lives. It's not just, you know, entertainment.
And we made an intentional decision at the beginning to have them tell their stories entirely on their own, that we would not drop in as a kind of reporterly voice. And with this final story that we're going to share with you, I mean, I think this is kind of, for me, is most emblematic of that notion of a baby bird. This storyteller entrusted us with her story and entrusted us to share it with you in a way that we hope is careful and respectful. And so with that, I invite you to put your blindfolds on one last time. We'll meet up with you on the other end for a Q&A. But here's our final story. It's called On Principle.
My name is Layla, but that's not my real name. It's a pseudonym, which I'm using just to be safe. I mostly grew up in Iran. I spent around 3-4 years in Isfahan. It's gorgeous. It has this amazing, really beautiful mosques that have these colors like teal and blue, and they're like the colors of heaven. Like literally, that's what they're supposed to be. And when you're there, it feels like you're in a different world. And I just remember growing up having lots of fun. I used to play football. I was really bad, so I was always the goalkeeper, which, you know, when you're the goalkeeper, you're not doing great. There was a community. And then when I was around 8-9 years old, we moved to Tehran because jobs are in Tehran. Tehran is a very complicated city. It's an extremely busy city. It's polluted, it's annoying, people are always in rush. But at the same time, it's so lively. Everything happens in Tehran. This was around the time where everyone wanted change. I think it was 2009. And Mousavi, who was one of the candidates, he seemed to be the guy. He seemed to be the person that had the promise of change and progress. NGOs to have more freedom of speech, better economy.
Race. Former Iranian Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi could unseat current President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad come June. But to do that,
and we were very hopeful. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. You had the color green, which was kind of his symbol and the symbol of his campaign. You would wear green and we would have this green bracelets and green watches, and you would be in the street and it would feel so alive and so full of hope. This wind of change in the air, because like you feel like there's a whole nation that is going to vote for this guy, and you're like on top of the mountain of your hopes and dreams and everything's going to get better. And then the election happened.
The entire world is watching the presidential election in Iran for signs of where that country is.
Like, I remember sitting in front of my computer that night. I was at my brother's house and everyone was there. And we start seeing the results coming in.
First, the challenger, Mir Hossein Mousavi, claimed in spite of dirty tricks at the poll, evidence showed that he was the winner.
But after polls closed, the government declared President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad the winner by a landslide.
And that Mousavi was not winning, and Ahmadinejad was winning.
This morning in Iran, shock and confusion at an election result few here expected.
I can remember this feeling of pure disappointment.
All wrong, and the people knows that. But we cannot do
and fear and panic and depression, like all at the same time happening, and anger, so much anger. Mousavi, he lost. In a heartbeat, everything changed. Ahmadinejad became the president. And Ahmadinejad has already been our president for 4 years. We knew he's a terrible president. We didn't want him to win. And we knew that most people were not going to vote for him and were going to vote for Mousavi. If this is a democracy to vote, we voted. This must have been rigged. This is not fair. After we all realized that that's it. There's not going to be a recount. There's not going to be a change in the results. I think that was the moment where everyone just lost their shit. And a whole nation just went in the street and demanded for something to change. We wanted our votes back. This was not a revolution. This was a demonstration and a protest to say, hey, can you please fix it? The first day was the silent protest because we wanted to say this is a peaceful protest. Thousands of people in the streets just not saying anything and having a V hand up in the air. And then towards the end of it, we started hearing gunshots coming from the rooftop of a house or something. It was the guards, it was the police. They started shooting at people. Me and my brother, weirdly, instead of just running away, we stepped towards where the gunshot is because it felt so surreal that we were like, oh, what's happening? And all I know is that my mom just grabbed our bags and just dragged us back, like, no, this way. And we just started running like the opposite way. And I think we all realized that it's not gonna be what we thought it's going to be. There would be days we would just ditch the classes just to go to the demonstrations. I remember the first month intensely because it was almost every day. One day it was with family, one day it was with people from your school, one day it was me on my own. I think it went on for months. So when you go to demonstrations, you have to be very prepared. First, you make sure you have water with you, your phone is charged and everything. But we also used to take a few cigarettes and a lighter because when there's tear gas, one of the best things that works with the burning of the eye is smoke. It actually calms it down. And I remember at one point when there was a tear gas, I took out my cigarette and I was like, I'm gonna handle this, and I don't smoke. So I just had the lighter on and I was doing this really, in Farsi you call it chos dude, like fart puffs, because they're so not powerful. And this guy just comes and takes my cigarette and then flips it the other way, so the end is now in his mouth and he starts blowing into it and the smoke comes out of the filter. I don't know why, but it was very powerful and it worked really great. I remember there was this day that we went for another protest. I remember I was with my family and my friend. We were all in the streets. But at some point, the guards then start running back towards us and they keep following us. And I turn right into one of the streets and I wait, and then I turn back and I see this very young boy with a gun right in front of me, and he's pointing the gun at me. And I kind of froze, like I didn't know if I should run or stay there or what to do. Like when someone has a gun pointed at you, like you don't know what the right thing to do is, because you're like, oh, if I make an extra step, he could shoot. The boy, I think he seemed hesitant. Like, I don't want to be here. You don't want to be here. Why is this happening? So I just took that facial expression as a sign and started just backing off. And then I ran. On one hand, you're in the streets and you're with a group of people that you love, fighting for something that you truly care about. And you look around and there's thousands of people hand in hand. And it's beautiful. You're all chanting together. You're all walking together. It's harmony and it's companionship, feeling relief when you come back at the end of the day that you're alive and that you got to say what you wanted to say. And at the same time, it's so heartbreaking to see that you even have to fight for things like this. Like, shouldn't that be the given? I had friends who got arrested and you might just not hear from them for days. And it's horrible because you don't know if they're dead, if they're alive. And that makes you realize that there's a very, very high cost for being a part of this movement. You very vividly forever will remember feeling this extremely tight hand around your neck. That sometimes you're like, did people die for nothing? Like, why am I even doing this? When I moved to the US around 2015, I had this excitement of leaving this country with all this drama behind, of being in the West, starting school, having all these opportunities. And I started realizing slowly that, oh shit, I'm really alone. I miss my community, I miss my friends. Right now, when sometimes things happen back home that are shitty, like events that cause demonstrations and protests, I have a rush of anxiety, a little bit of hope, because I'm like, well, we're doing something. And a lot of guilt, because then I realize it's not we are doing something, it's that they are doing something and I'm watching from distance in my house. This survival guilt, it's sometimes unbearable, and it like ruins a lot of beautiful things, I think, in life. I call my friends now sometimes, and when something goes on, and say, do not fucking leave the house. Sometimes I'm like, I don't care what the greater good is. You are too important for me to go out and fight for justice and die. And I hate that side of me. I really hate being a coward and asking others to be cowards. But I'm also very selfish at this moment. And I'm like, I think I had enough. But Iran is home. I wish home was a place to stay.
All right, welcome back, everyone. That was our last story for the night. And before we wrap it up, I think we just want to thank once again all of you for coming, and especially James and everyone at the Museum of Science for supporting this program. I'll just say that, when we first discussed doing this as a virtual show back in April, we did the first round of it, I was a little skeptical of the whole concept of like, why would people want to come and just listen to audio stories? They could just put on their favorite podcast and lay down and do it themselves. And I think the feedback after we got after that show was so strong that it really kind of made me rethink that assumption and think about the value of listening together, all of us at the same time. As simple as that is, it's very meaningful, and to be able to share our work in this kind of setting with you all is really a very special treat for us. So thank you for joining us, and thank you again to the museum for supporting it. It means a lot to us.
I'll just echo what Ian said and tell you that we've got more shows like this one coming up, so stay tuned. And Ian mentioned a podcast, listening to your favorite podcast. Ian and I are lucky enough to get to work on another project together right now, a podcast called Nova Now. It's about the science behind the headlines. It's by Nova and PRX and GBH, and we invite you to check it out by finding it wherever you find your podcasts. Again, that's Nova Now.